go ahead, as is our wont, and start with prayer. So, O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen. We're going to be, when we start here in just a moment, picking up in Genesis chapter 16, and to get us kind of caught up a little bit before we start, as we're going through the life of Abraham. I'm not going to go back over everything we went over last time, obviously, because Genesis chapter 15, there's a whole lot packed into there. We talked about a lot of things last time, and so if I went through all of them, we wouldn't get to very much this time. But the core of what has just happened before chapter 16, where we're picking up tonight, is that in chapter 15, God made his covenant with Abraham. And we talked about how a covenant is not just sort of like an agreement or a contract, but that a covenant, again, I don't want to go back all over it, and I'm tempted to go down the rabbit trail, but that God made these promises to Abraham regarding his seed, both a promise in terms of quantity, in terms of how many descendants he would have, that whole nations would be descended from him, but then also a promise in terms of quality, that his descendants would shine like the stars of heaven. And we talked about how that's a way that the Old Testament in particular talks about what we call theosis, because ancient people, including Abram, being as he was from the city of Ur, he's a Sumerian, they understood that the stars of the heavens were angelic beings or divine beings. And so this is not only just the promise of, hey, you're going to have a lot of kids, but that this promise of salvation. And so then Abram, being very advanced in age, having a wife who's very advanced in age, sort of asked God for a sign. And first, God performed a ritual with him that, again, I won't go into detail on. Again, you can listen to the video from last time where he cut a number of animals in half, and God passed through the midst, which was sort of an oath-taking related to those promises. But then also, God gave Abram another sign, and that sign was related to this huge area of land in the Middle East and what's called the Levant, not just Palestine, but including a lot of Syria, a lot of Lebanon, a lot of the Transjordan, this very large area, which he told Abram he would give to his descendants, plural. Sometimes we forget that it was nations plural descended from Abram. It wasn't just Israel, it was also Edom and Moab and Ammon, the Ishmaelites, who we're going to learn a little bit more about tonight, the Midianites. These are all tribes and groups descended from Abram, who came to occupy that whole piece of land. And so that was given to Abram as a sign, meaning that this was sort of the down payment or the sort of material sign that once that was received, then the rest, right, the rest of those promises were then sure to be fulfilled, because this one thing that was predicted came true more quickly. And then that means that the larger thing further in the future is also going to be equally as solid and firm and true. And so that was basically what happened. That's basically all of chapter 15 was this. And so these promises have been made. God has sworn this oath to Abram. This oath-taking ritual has taken place. He's told him about this sign. But as we pick up here in chapter 16, the issue still remains that Abram is now pushing 100, and his wife, Sarai, is pushing 90, and they don't have any children at all. And as Abram pointed out in chapter 15 that we talked about last time, one of his chief servants was essentially going to be his heir, sort of one of his trusted men was going to inherit everything when he died because they had no children. And so now as we start here in chapter 16, Abram has these promises made to him by God, but he also has this sort of material reality in front of him where he doesn't understand exactly how what God has promised can possibly actually happen. So that's sort of the dilemma he's in as we begin chapter 16. And so unless there are any comments or questions or ambiguities that need to get cleared up left over from last time or from that summary, we'll go ahead and pick up here in Genesis chapter 16, starting in verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. We'll pause there that Hagar, not a super popular name for women anymore. When we think of Hagar, we think of Hagar the Horrible, maybe from the comic strips, or if you're a nerd of a certain age, Mike Hagar from Final Fight in the arcades. I know I'm an old man, no one else has heard of that, but this is sort of the origin of that name. So, and Hagar is expressly said here to be an Egyptian woman, and she is a trusted servant. The line between servant and slave in this kind of lifestyle is relatively slim. What I mean by this type of lifestyle is Abram, of course, at this point, and Sarai are living this nomadic existence in Canaan, right? They aren't settled. They're basically camping on someone else's land at this point, even though God has promised the land to them, at least to their descendants here in the relatively near term. So if you are dwelling in a city, for example, then the line between someone's servant and someone's slave is sort of very clear, right? If you are a slave, you are owned, you are the possession. An enslaved person is seen to belong to the person who has purchased them, and that person can then sell them. And so we fortunately are able to take for granted that Christianity over the course of the last 2,000 years, at least in Western and Eastern Orthodox societies, has really broken down the way humanity and human nature was seen in the ancient world. So even though we've had our moments in the last 2,000 years that weren't great, but in the ancient world, what you see by and large is the idea that human nature is not one thing, right? This is why this comes out of Christianity. As Christians, because we believe Christ, who is God, became man, not just a man, but became man, took upon himself our shared human nature. That makes our human nature a sort of universal, right? It means that all of us share this human nature together. All of us share it. Christ came to share in it with us. And that's what unites each of us to him, what unites all of us to him, and what unites us to one another, right? So we understand human nature to be universal, and that every human person is made in the image of God, has this same human nature, has this same dignity, right? And that human nature is different than any animal nature or plant nature or any other, on the other side, angelic nature, right? That that humanity is one thing that we all share, and it's different from all of these other things fundamentally. So what you find in the ancient world is not that. What you find pretty much universally in the ancient world outside of Israel is the idea that there are different sort of qualities of human, right? That there are, and depending on where you are in the ancient world, who's considered what will vary. So the word in most ancient Near Eastern languages, for example, Egyptian is a good example of this. The word for human in Egyptian and in most other ancient Near Eastern language is the same word as the word for Egyptian. For them to be human, to be a person, means to be an Egyptian. And so built into their language was the understanding that non-Egyptians were sort of subhuman. Non-Egyptians were sort of on this other tier, this lower tier, right? And this is true of all of these tribes and groups and nations, right? They are what it means to be human. Below that is everything else, right? And they use this then to justify, right? So for them, we're jumping ahead to Exodus, but in Exodus, for the Egyptians to enslave the Israelites and other non-Egyptians, to them made sense. To them, that was a good thing, because they'd say, well, look, if you let an ox or a bull, right, run wild, it's just going to be destructive and destroy things. No, you've got to take it, you've got to domesticate it, you've got to put it to work, right? And then society flows smoothly, right? Because it's an animal. That's how the Egyptians looked at non-Egyptian people. They had a word for them. It's usually translated Asiatics. That's what they called the Israelites and pretty much all other foreigners who showed up in Egypt. And so not only was it okay to enslave those people, but they thought it was the right and good thing to do. And this is true all through the ancient world. We've been taught a revisionist version of a lot of ancient history. So for example, the Greeks, we hear about the Greeks, especially the Athenians, as sort of the founders of democracy, right? But the demos in democracy, the people, right? In democracy for Athenians, were Athenians. They believed that the Athenians, were created by the gods, by their gods, the goddess Athena and the god Hephaestus, out of the soil of Athens. So they believe not only were they created special, as opposed to all the other humans in the world, but that they were directly connected to that land and it belonged to them by sort of divine right, right? And so everyone else was not Athenian. So it's not like someone else from some other city-state could move to Athens and then vote, even during the brief period when there was democracy in Athens, right? Because they were not Athenians. They were not one of the people, right? And the Athenians had slaves, right? The Spartans were notorious for brutally enslaving all of their neighbors. And all of their neighbors were also Greeks, right? But they weren't Spartans. They weren't Lacedaemonians. And so that made them sort of inferior. The Romans, this is obvious. We see this all through the New Testament, right? Where the Roman, being a Roman citizen in particular, puts you in one category, in one class, and not being a Roman citizen puts you in the same class as a horse or cattle, or right. So this is how humanity was understood pre-Christianity. And the fact that we now look at that, hopefully, there have been periods in Christian history where we've lapsed back into that. We've fallen back into that kind of idea where we sort of, in our pride, exalt ourselves, whoever the we is at any given time, and dehumanize other people, where we haven't followed through on the teachings of Christianity fully. But the culture has been so transformed by Christianity that now we look at someone who believes that, we find it repulsive, we find it abhorrent, right? Where someone who believes that is abhorrent to us. And if someone accuses us of being a racist or something, we take that as a great insult, right? That's a major insult to us because we find that kind of thinking abhorrent. But this is what we're dealing with in the ancient world. And so slavery is very common. Now, a servant, right? If you're talking about a city in the time of Abram, a servant in city life is someone who is free, right? Someone who is one of the people, but they are of a different social standing, right? So if again we talk about take the Egyptians as an example, right? You have Pharaoh, who's at the top of the hierarchy, right? If we want to semi-ironically use a pyramid as our example for Egyptian society, you have the Pharaoh at the top, right? Who's sort of divine, right? He's up there at the top, sort of touching where the gods are, right? And then as you go down, you have various noble people, right? And eventually you get down to your common Egyptians, your Egyptian laborers, your Egyptian craftsmen, your Egyptian servants, right, who are serving in Pharaoh's house or in other people's houses. And then you have this big gap until you get to non-Egyptians, right? But so being a servant puts you up in that, at least you're at the bottom of that top category. So it's like being lower upper class or lower middle class, right? You're at the bottom of your social standing, but you're still there in that social category. But then there is, as I mentioned, this big gap where you get to slaves, right, who are treated as not human and are not free, have no decision-making power. Okay? Now, in a nomadic type of existence, like Abram and Sarai are living, they're living with their big extended family. So they have all of their family members, all of the cousins, all of the aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews. Like, remember, Lot is one of Abram's nephews. All of these folk, right, who are all part of this big extended family community, who are living in tents, living together. You have their servants, you have herdsmen, like we talked about when Abram and Lot were dividing the land, who are taking care of the livestock. You have various tradesfolk who are maintaining the tents and maintaining the animals and the pack animals and that kind of thing. So there's this big community, right, centered around this family. And then you have sort of servants. So someone like Hagar, who's a servant to Sarai, all that is to say, would have not been per se a slave the way a slave in a city was. She would have been considered a servant, but at the same time, she's living in this community as a servant. It's not as if she could just say, man, I'm sick of working for Sarai. She's a tough boss. I'm going to go get a job over here, right? So even though she's not technically a slave, her options in terms of what she can do, how much free choice and free is sort of severely restricted. So that's what I meant when I said the line between a slave and a servant, when we're talking about a nomadic household setting like this, is kind of indistinct, right? It's kind of a dotted line. She's sort of straddling that line. Okay. So even this first verse, this first sentence, even if you haven't read this before, you may have heard the story before, but even if you haven't, you may be able to guess already sort of where this is going, right? Sarai's a 90-year-old woman. She hasn't been able to give Abram a child or an heir, but she has this Egyptian servant. Verse 2, so Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." Thus Abram obeyed the voice of Sarai. Okay, so Sarai has an idea. She says, okay, Abram, you have this dilemma, right? God has promised you these things. He's made these oaths to you. He's made these promises. You don't see how that could happen, right? Sarai perhaps feeling bad about it, right? Because, of course, at this time, we're talking about 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago. As a woman, right, who's married to Abram, one of her sort of social responsibilities in that culture was to give him children, and she hasn't, right? But so she suggests to Abram, why don't you sleep with my servant? She's younger, right, much younger, and see if she can bear you a child, and then you can essentially adopt him, right, as your heir. But something to notice here is that notice she says not just that Abram might get children through her, but that Sarai might get children through her. So Sarai is not here just looking to, well, I haven't been able to, I feel bad, let's do it this way, right? Like, why don't you marry her, right? Polygamy was practiced. It wasn't good. It wasn't what God wanted, but it was practiced at this time. You know, she doesn't suggest he take Hagar as a second wife. He doesn't. So Sarai is not wanting to do anything helpful for Hagar. In fact, she wants to use Hagar, and she's planning to also claim the child. Meaning her intent is that Hagar will become pregnant, bear a child, and then she plans to take that child away from her and treat it as her child with Abram. So this is not sort of a humble act on her part, sort of a humble and confused act on her part. But also, she is sort of treating Hagar as sort of subhuman, at least less than her, and not caring about her and her well-being. But also, Abram now is facing this temptation. He's facing this test, right? God has not only promised him this, right, but he has sworn him an oath that, as we talked about last time, God essentially promised in the oath that if he did not fulfill his promises to Abram, he would die, right? That's the level of oath that God took to Abram, right? And so Abram now has to decide, do I trust the promises of God? Even though I can't see materially, I can't see how this could possibly happen. Do I trust that? Or do I kind of take matters into my own hands? Do I try to make this happen? Right? Because maybe I don't trust God to take care of it for me. Right? And so this is kind of a very human moment and human dilemma that all of us face all the time, right? Where we know through the services of the church, through going to church, through the teaching of the church, through the scriptures, we know what God has promised us. And we may even go and faithfully pray and ask God and pour our heart out to God and say, this is what I need. This is the help I need from you. This is the encouragement I need from you. This is the strengthening I need from you. This is what I'm struggling with, right? But then after we've done that, it's very hard to sort of trust him. Because often we look around at our circumstances, right? Look around at our circumstances and we think, I don't see how this is going to work out, right? I don't see how this is going to work out. And so what we're seeing here in the life of Abraham is a dynamic that we also see several other places in the scriptures, right? This is what's going on when St. Peter tries to walk to Christ on the water. He gets out on the water and then he looks around at the wind and the waves, and all of a sudden he starts to sink, right? Because he looks around and says, wait a minute, you can't walk on water, right? This isn't possible, right? This is what Christ is talking about when he talks about not worrying about the future, about what we'll eat, what we'll drink, what we'll wear, right? He's really talking about this same kind of idea, right? Because it's not just that worrying is unproductive. That's true. He points that out, that no one by worrying can add a day to their life or a foot to their height, or however those metaphors he uses are translated. That's true. Worrying is just expending energy on nothing. But also because when we worry like that, we're really trying to take matters into our own hands. We're really trying to take control. I need to figure out what I'm going to do to make sure that I have the things I need tomorrow, right? I need to be in control of this. I need to act. I need to do it because I don't trust God. I don't trust God. And so we're going to see here, well, we already saw it said that Abram thought this was a great idea. So Abram here makes the wrong choice, right? We're going to see how that plays out now, the rest of tonight's Bible study, but he makes the wrong choice. But the right choice, the choice that we need to again and again and again make when we're facing worry and we're facing trouble, when we know the promises of God, but we don't see materially how that can possibly work out in our circumstances. We have to be reminded that even in those moments when we think we're most in control of our life, we're still not in control of our life. That's an illusion. It's an illusion that our pride throws up in front of us. I've got it under control. I'm the boss. I'm in charge. I have everything in my hands, right? That's just an arrogant lie that we tell ourselves, right? That even in those moments, it's God who's in control. And not only that, but God being in control when we feel like we're in control and when we feel like we're out of control. God's still in control in both. He does a better job in his control, in having the whole world in his hand, the whole cosmos in his hands. He does a better job with it than we would if we were in charge. Even though, again, arrogantly, we might sometimes think otherwise when we second guess him and challenge him. Why did he do that? Why did he let this happen to me? He does a much better job than we would. He does a much better job than I would, for sure, because I get petty and vengeful and everything else, right? God does not. So this is what we need to be reminded of. This is what Abram needed to do. But as we're going to see, that's not the way he goes. This is a place where he makes the wrong decision. So verse 3, then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife after Abram dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So that to be his wife, that's not saying he married her as a second wife, really. That's a euphemism. So the idea is that he slept with her. He had sexual relations with her. The Orthodox Study Bible here is trying to be PG, right? This was after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So they had been there for 10 years at the time this happened. Verse 4, so he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Verse 5, then Sarai said to Abram, my wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace. And when she saw she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. May God judge between you and me. Okay. So, essentially here, once Hagar is pregnant, Sarai says, oh, she becomes jealous and says, oh, she's trying to take my place, right? She's trying to usurp my position as your wife because she's giving you a baby and I couldn't, right? So that's the idea here, right? So Sarai now becomes jealous, right? Even though this was her plan to begin with, right? And you can understand how she, right, would become jealous. This is her husband. Not only is her husband now sleeping with this other woman, but where Sarah did not bear him a child, Hagar now is bearing him a child. So Sarai thinks he's going to love her more. I'm going to be cast aside, right? And so now she's saying, you need to do something about her. She's the problem, right? Now, notice Hagar hasn't gotten to say anything yet. She hasn't had any real choice in any of this, right? But she's sort of being used as a pawn in this. And again, Sarai doesn't really seem to care about her at all. She had this plan, and now she's decided, oh, this is a bad plan. One other note, because it might be helpful in the background here. It's important to know here and coming up later that in the ancient world, especially the ancient Near East, they did not understand the concept of male infertility. What I mean by that is they understood human reproduction in a sort of very literal way in terms of agriculture, because they were mostly farmers. So they believed that the male planted seed inside the woman, and the woman was like soil. And so the seed would either grow in the woman or not. And so in the same way that if a farmer planted a bunch of seed in a certain patch of soil and it didn't grow there, but it grew in other patches of soil, then they would say, oh, well, that's bad soil, right? That was the problem. The whole problem was that soil is bad. And so in the same way, these ancient cultures, if a woman like Sarai did not have children, they blamed her. It was her fault somehow. She was doing something wrong or was bad, right? And so that's a part of this too, underlying that jealousy, is that the fact that now this other woman is having a baby means there's something wrong with her, right? And that's part of this cultural surroundings. This is part of why she's so concerned and upset and jealous and angry now, even though you'd say, well, wait a minute, I thought this was your plan in the first place. Why would you be upset that it worked, essentially? But so she comes to Abram and says, you need to do something about this. Verse 6, thus Abram said to Sarai, indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do with her as you please. So when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. Okay. So there's lots of euphemisms here again, right? But so it becomes very clear here that Abram doesn't care about Hagar either. He's now been having sexual relations with Hagar. She's carrying his child in her womb. And Abram basically just says to Sarai, yeah, do whatever you want with her. She's your servant. I don't care. Right. So this is, shall we say, highly problematic, right? Highly problematic. This is clearly not what God wanted when he made those promises to Abram, right? This is not what he wanted to unfold, right? He wanted trust, he wanted faithfulness, he wanted loyalty from Abram, right? And instead they hatched this plan. Now the plan has gone sideways, and we've got this woman Hagar who's a victim in all this. And so to remove the euphemism, when it says Sarai dealt harshly with her, that doesn't mean she was just mean and catty. That means she beat her. Okay. So Sarai responds by literally violently, I'm sure she said harsh things too, but literally violently treating this servant, right? And making it so bad that Hagar then flees. Okay. I don't think we necessarily understand how significant this is, because remember, they're living this nomadic lifestyle. So she's not fleeing to a place, right? She doesn't have like belongings. She doesn't have money. Like money, coins don't exist at this time in history. Okay, so she's got like the clothes on her back. She's a pregnant woman who's run away from this sort of family camp where she's been living as a servant. Okay, anyone who finds her on the road can literally do anything they want to her, up to and including killing her, and nothing will happen to them. They will never be found, right? She's just out on her own on the road with nothing, right? So that's how bad Sarai made her life, for having the gall to get pregnant, right? That she was willing to run away and risk all that rather than stay, right? We need to be clear on that, right? So Abram and Sarah have deeply, deeply wronged her. Verse 7, now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. So Hagar is fleeing, doesn't have anything, right? And so along the road, she finds a spring of water. So she stops there to drink some water, because this is what you have to do to get water, right? You have to hope you find some. And while she's there, the angel of the Lord comes to her. Now, we talked about last time at the beginning of chapter 15, when those promises were made to Abram, we saw that the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. And we talked about at that time, the fact that the word of the Lord came to him in a vision means the word of the Lord was something Abram saw, or someone Abram saw, right, who appeared to him and talked to him and told him these things, right? So what we're finding here in Genesis, this is going to set the tone, not just for the rest of Genesis or the rest of the Torah, but for the rest of the Old Testament, is that there is, in addition to Yahweh, the God of Israel, who no one can see, right, there's also Yahweh, the God of Israel, who people do see, right, who appears to people like the vision that Abraham had, right, and who will appear and come and talk to people. And we saw one of the names is the word of the Lord, right, the word of God. That's one of the names for this person, who is God, but is also distinguished from God. And now the angel of the Lord, we're going to see here, is another one of those. And we shouldn't be tripped up too much by the word angel, right? Because where this is going, of course, when you think about the word of God, right, who appeared to Abram, we talked about last time, this is the same word of God that St. John talks about at the beginning of his gospel that we read on Pascha. You know, in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. The word became flesh. So this is Christ, right? This is Christ, the second person of the Holy Trinity, right? God the Son. So there's God the Father, who no one can see. There's God the Son, right, who people do see. So sometimes people get tripped up by the fact that he's called the angel of the Lord. And you say, well, Christ isn't an angel, right? But the word angel, whether we're talking about malach in Hebrew or angelos in Greek, is not the name of like a species of being, right? So the word angel is not like the word raccoon or the word human, right? Or the word tree, where it's telling you a type of thing. Angel literally means messenger. So the word angel is a job description, right? So there are places in the Old Testament where it's clear in context that that same word, malach in Hebrew or angelos in Greek, is being used for like messengers sent by the king, right? Now, the king doesn't have a bunch of angels who work for him in the way that we think about angels, right? God's angels. But he has messengers, right? So anyone who comes and brings a message is a messenger, right? And so it could be called the messenger of the Lord, the messenger of Yahweh in that sense. Okay, so don't get tripped up by that. But so how do we know that this isn't just an angel, right, who finds Hagar here at the spring? Well, we'll see here going forward. Because in verse 8, then he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? She replied, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord then said to her, return to your mistress and humble yourself under her hand. Again, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will surely multiply your seed exceedingly, that it may not be counted because of its multitude. So we'll pause there. Why did I say that we'll see, right? Because an angel could have said those first couple things, right? An angel could say to Hagar, hey, where did you come from and where are you going? Right? And an angel could give her the message, hey, you should really go back. It's not safe for you out here. You should go back, right? Despite what you've suffered there. But an angel could not say, I, in the first person, I will surely multiply your seed exceedingly, that they may not be counted because of number. Why couldn't an angel say that? Well, an angel, first of all, couldn't do that. An angel by himself in his own power could not. He didn't say, God will multiply your seed exceedingly. He said, I will. Right? That's number one. And then number two is this particular thing that he's saying he will do is the exact same thing that God told Abram he would do in the last chapter for his offering. So it's not just that he's making the promise in the first person, it's that he's making the same promise God did and doing it in the first person the same way God did. Right? Which means that the angel of the Lord, the messenger of Yahweh here, is also God and distinguished from God. Right? This is the beginning all the way back here in the book of Genesis of the scriptures starting to teach us about the Holy Trinity. It's kind of shadowy and hard to understand here. When Christ is born in the New Testament, when we read the Gospels, it becomes clear, right? Christ manifests himself in the world. And so we now come to understand and to know more fully. But it's already here, just in a shadowy, kind of difficult form, because you would read this and say, well, wait a minute, it sounds like this angel of the Lord, this angel of God, is also God, but he's called the angel of God. He's not just called God, right? So what's going on, right? That becomes clear once we meet, right, our Lord Jesus Christ in the New Testament. But so this is Christ who has come to talk to Hagar, right? Then he continues. Once again, the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has taken notice of your humiliation. He shall be, this is an interesting translation, he shall be a rustic man, and his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. He shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. So this is this additional prophecy. So we had, just like with Abram, we saw God's promises to him talked about his seed, plural. You're going to have all these descendants. And then he said, you're going to have this one seed in particular. That was pointing in the short term to Isaac and then the long term to Christ. So also here, he talks about seed, plural, coming from Hagar, but also then gives a prophecy about her son, Ishmael, in particular. So Ishmael, we're told here, they translate it rustic man. and his hand will be against his neighbors. This is what it's getting at in the original languages, is sort of the equivalent that Ishmael is going to be a hard man, right? Think Johnny Cash, right? So this is, he's not going to be a kind of soft person. He's not going to be the kind of like a wealthy person dwelling in tents and living a luxurious lifestyle, right? He's going to be a hard man. He's going to be a tough guy. He's going to be a man who lives nomadically, lives out in the wilderness, lives by his wits. And not just him, but his descendants, right? This is the kind of lifestyle they're going to maintain. And historically, this is going to happen. The Ishmaelites and some of the Edomites later are going to kind of combine to become the Midianites. So there'll be Ishmaelites and Edomites and Midianites. And the Ishmaelites and the Midianites are going to sort of remain nomadic, even when the Edomites and the Israelites and everything settle sort of in their own lands and in their own nations. The Ishmaelites and the Midianites are really never going to have sort of a settled nation in cities. They're going to continue to live in the deserts and a more nomadic existence as traders, and that's Trader, and as travelers. Particularly in between Egypt and what will become sort of the settled nations of their cousins, right? So, well, I'll continue here. So verse 13, then Hagar called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have seen the one who appeared to me face to face." Okay. So notice also here that when she says to the angel of the Lord, right, says to him, "You are the God who sees me." He doesn't stop and say, "Whoa, time out, I'm not God," right? We see angels doing that often in the scriptures, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. We see angels who will, people will, when an angel first appears to them, they'll be sort of stunned and afraid, and they'll fall down and try to worship them. And the angels always say, "No, no, 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 right? Don't worship me, only worship God," right? But when Hagar says, "You are the God who sees me," the angel of the Lord does not like correct her and say no, right? He accepts that, yes. And notice, even further clarifying it, she says, "I have seen the one who appeared to me face to face," clearly indicating, I've seen God face to face. And again, he doesn't correct her. So she doesn't say, "I saw one of God's messengers face to face. I saw an angel face to face. I saw God face to face." Right. 14, therefore she called the well of him I saw before me. Observe, it is between Kadesh and Bered. Okay. So the well of him I saw before me doesn't roll trippingly off the tongue, but the idea is she names the well after the one who appeared to her there, who she's identifying as God, right? The one God. That was the one, she keeps using that language, who appeared before her. And notice that this is a geographical location that was known to people, right? That's what that behold is. It's saying, here's where it is. You could still go to that spring now. You can go see it, right? Now, obviously, this is later, right? Because sort of the earliest layer of the Torah or the Pentateuch comes from Moses' time, right? And Abram lived, at least, depending on when you date Moses, and I'm not getting into that because it's a long argument and it's boring to me, but depending on when you date Moses, is at least 500 years before Moses, right? But so this is saying, even at that later date when this was being written down for the Torah, for the Pentateuch, that was still a known place on the road between these two cities where you could go see the spring where Hagar met God. Verse 15, so Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Now Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So she goes back, as the angel of the Lord told her to. She goes back to Abram and to Sarai, but something to key in on here, right? It doesn't come right out and say to us that, oh, well, she told them about the angel and so they treated her better, right? Or this resolved the situation. But we are told here that when the child is born, Abram names him Ishmael, right? Meaning she did tell him, because remember, the angel of the Lord told her what his name would be. So this has been conveyed to Abram, right? So he not only is she accepted back, which technically they could have thrown her right back out, but she is accepted back. Abram acknowledges the child as his own, names the child. We don't read anything here about Sarai claiming the child as her own. Right. So thinly veiled behind the text here is the fact that Hagar coming back and telling them what happened, telling them this story about her encountering God, right? That this has now changed sort of their mindset, changed the way they're thinking about the situation, right? At least at that level. And that now she is being treated differently than they had planned to treat her, and better, right? And with more dignity, right? So Ishmael is Abram's first son, right? And he acknowledges him, he names him. Ishmael does not just disappear from the text. There's going to be a little bit, not a lot, but there's going to be a little bit more about Ishmael here as we go forward in the story of the life of Abram. But so this episode as a whole here that we read about in Genesis 16, in addition to what we've already talked about, there are some important things happening here. One of them is Hagar is only in the text. Because remember, we picked up reading in Genesis chapter 12. So Genesis chapters 1 through 11, as we discussed, are sort of giving us this very early history of the world, right? The creation of the world, the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise, right? And then the genealogies of Cain and Seth leading up to the flood, the destruction of the world in the flood, and then the story in Genesis 10 and 11 of God dividing the nations, right, at the Tower of Babel. And at the time, God divided the nations in Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel. We talked about how this is because God had to withdraw from humanity, right? Because in Genesis 6, when the flood comes, God is still dwelling on earth close with men, but men are becoming incredibly sinful and wicked. And so part of what's going on in the flood story is that God's holiness, God's perfection, his holiness, his justice is damaging, is harmful, is destructive to sinful humanity. And so humanity gets sort of wiped out in the flood because it can't survive in that wickedness, right, in God's presence. And so God promises, the sign is given after the flood in Genesis chapter 9, where God sets his bow in the clouds. And when we think of rainbows, we usually read that bow part as if it's like the bow on a package or something, because it's pretty and colorful. But it's actually bow as in a bow and arrow, right? A bow and arrow that you shoot. And so the idea is that the rainbow is God's bow, like his bow and arrow, but he's set it down, He set it down, symbolizing, because he's setting it down, that he is now no longer going to make war against humanity, right? He's laying down his arms. He's unilaterally disarming, right? Because of his love for humanity. And he says, when you look and see that my bow is still sitting there, I haven't picked it up again, you'll know that the promise is true, that I will not destroy humanity again. But so then the problem comes, as we read about in Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel, that humanity is very quickly becoming very wicked again, right? And so if God remains with them, then this is going to be destructive to them. Humanity will be wiped out again. And so he has another option, right? And that is that he distances himself from humanity. He steps back, he sort of leaves, right? And these dynamics in Genesis 1 through 11 are going to play out sort of throughout the Old Testament and even throughout the scriptures as a whole, right? Because in Genesis 3, what happens with Adam and Eve is once Adam and Eve transgress and eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they take evil into themselves, they become sinful, they can no longer dwell in paradise with God. And so they're sent out, right? It's the same issue, right? So they are sent out. God remains in paradise, but they're sent out. In Genesis 6, God remains with humanity and humanity is destroyed. In Genesis 11, God steps back away from humanity. He scatters the nations, right? Spreads them out, puts them under the authority of angels, of angelic beings, right, to govern them while he steps back, right? And we're going to see this play out, but this is how the exile is going to work later in the history of Israel. That Israel itself is going to become very sinful and wicked, and it's going to get to the point where God says, I can no longer remain here with you, you'll be destroyed. And so Ezekiel sees God depart from the temple, sort of like what happens at the Tower of Babel, where God departs, and then the people are sent into exile, right? The way Adam and Eve were exiled from paradise, right? For their protection and their safety, right? Always with the intent that the time would come with Christ in the New Testament when they would be brought back. But so in Genesis, coming back to Genesis now, we saw in Genesis 1 through 11, Genesis 11, God withdraws, he pulls back. And then Genesis 12 was God sort of re-engaging with humanity. And he did that with Abram. Abram was living in Ur, the largest city at the time, 2000 BC. Not just the largest city in the world at the time, but this was during, as we talked about in the very first Bible study on Abram, in the midst of the Sumerian Renaissance, right? This great cultural and artistic and literary period in the life of ancient Sumeria, the peak of human civilization at the time, and God comes to him and calls him to leave all that, right? And come out into the wilderness. This is how God, right, re-engages with humanity. So when God comes to Hagar next to that spring, as we just read, she is the second person who God comes and speaks to and makes promises to and interacts with directly. Up to this point, it's only been Abram. Now, the second person is not Sarai. It's not, the Pharaoh of Egypt when Abram went there. It's not someone, quote unquote, important, right? It's not someone who's a ruler, right? It's someone who at this point is essentially a helpless runaway slave, right? Someone she's a woman, she's a servant, slave, right on the cusp, right? She's displeased Sarai, not really through much fault of her own, but she has nothing. She's probably looking at dying out in the wilderness. She's a pregnant woman. She is at the bottom of all of society's hierarchies, the absolute base, right? This is sort of the last person you would expect to be the second person, the God who created the universe, right, would come to and appear to, right? It's not who you'd expect. But God is concerned about her, right? Because God has already identified himself as the God of Abram. When he entered into that covenant relationship with Abram in the last chapter, from the very beginning, when he first made those promises to Abram, he became Abram's God. And now Abram and his wife have mistreated this woman. This woman who has no recourse, right? There's no court, right? She can't sue. There's no ruler. There's no one she can take this case to, right? No one she could appeal to get any kind of justice, right? She's helpless. She's at the bottom, right? And so God intervenes, right? And God becomes, after being the God of Abram, now becomes her God, the God who sees her, right? No one else saw her. We saw Sarai and Abram didn't care about her a lick, right? And 99.9% of the world population didn't even know who she was, but God saw her. And God came and spoke to her face to face, right? To make the situation right, to correct the injustice, right? That Abram and Sarai had committed, right? And to bring healing and restoration to the situation. So repentance is not just being sorry and claiming you won't do it again. Repentance is changing and fixing what you've broken. So she needed to be restored. She needed to be restored to Abram and Sarai. They needed to correct how they treated her, how they viewed her and her child, right? This all needed to happen to bring healing. And God steps in to bring that about. And this is critically important for who God is all through the Old Testament. He not only identifies as the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, he identifies himself with those particular people, those particular humans. But he again and again identifies himself as the God who loves the orphan, the widow, the foreigner, right? The people who are helpless in this society, the people who have no one who cares about them, no one who sees them, no one who is fighting for them and their interests. Right? Those are the people who God identifies himself with. He says, I am their God. I am their God. I am the God of those people. I am the God of the people on the bottom of all of the world's hierarchies. I'm their God. Right? I will plead their case. I will defend them because no one else will. Right? And this makes God, our God, the true God, incredibly unique among all the gods of the ancient world and of the pagan world, even the pagan world up till today, right? Because all the gods of the nations, right? And this includes Western nations, right? Because a lot of countries, their leaders, including our own, talk about God an awful lot. But a lot of times the God they're talking about when they give speeches and stuff doesn't sound a whole lot like the real one. Because the God of the nations, even present day nations that are ostensibly Christian, is a God of power, a God of authority, a God of majesty, a God of winners, right? A God who represents strength and virtue and power and wealth and all the things that a culture and a civilization prizes. That's who that God represents, right? You want to be the God of Caesar, the God of Pharaoh, right? The God of the wealthy and the powerful, right? Who's even greater than them and who makes them great, right? That's how that God, those gods, those false gods are talked about. But God, because he is the true God, right? Yahweh, the God of Israel, the Holy Trinity, the true God, right, doesn't have to be quite that insecure, right? Because he is who he is, right? He can be the God of the weak and the powerless and the broken. Right? And so anyone who really understood the Torah and really understood the Old Testament when the 1st century AD rolls around and Jesus the Messiah is going to come, right? If they really understood the Old Testament, they wouldn't have thought that the Messiah was going to come and be this powerful king who was going to conquer the Romans and enslave them and make them the slaves of the Jewish people instead of the other way around, right? Who was going to set up some kind of powerful kingdom on earth with a huge army and all kinds of wealth for everybody and all of that, right? Anyone who had read and understood the Old Testament, anybody who had read and understood even just this chapter we read tonight, right, and seen this interaction between the God who created the universe and a slave woman on the side of a road, drinking out of a hole in the ground, right? Anyone who understood this would have said, no, I think when the Messiah comes, he's probably going to be poor. And he's probably going to go and minister to the poor and the sick and those who need healing. And I think he's probably going to come to people who are sinners, who are broken, who have made a lot of bad decisions, who are in distress and who are in trouble. Those are the people he's going to want to, especially if the Messiah turns out to be God himself. I think those are the people he's going to be interested in going and finding and talking to and seeing and helping and speaking to face. And if you had understood all of those things in the 1st century AD, then when you met Jesus of Nazareth, who came from Galilee, you wouldn't have had to do a lot of work to understand that he was the Messiah. You wouldn't have even had to do that much to understand that he's the angel of the Lord, that he's the Word of God, right? That he's God the Son. Right? Because what we read in the Gospels is about Christ, who has the exact same character as the God who we read about all through the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, the Christian Old Testament, right? And it's this same person who cares about Hagar in this moment, right, when she's been wronged. So we're definitely not going to have time to go through chapter 17 tonight because we have a hard out. And chapter 17, we get into circumcision and what it means. So that's going to be an evening all to itself next month, I have a feeling. So we have a little time here if anybody has any questions before we have to go.
Thank you, Father. And for anyone who's on the Bible study here live with us, feel free to type your question in chat or just feel free to unmute and ask your question out loud. It looks like Derek's already got his hand raised. So Derek, if you want to come off mute, go right ahead.
It appears that they didn't get claimed to have sinned, but it's obvious they did something wrong, and that's why God came and righted this wrong. This isn't an argument for predestination, but it does seem in a weird, strange way that this was almost bound to happen. I even noticed that as husband and wife, they're on the same page, and that kind of follows the rules that we should listen and respect each other. So is that kind of probably why it hasn't been that they sinned, because as husband and wife, they were on the same page, even though they were way off of what should be doing? Or is this just one of those, we just won't know?
Well, it's good for a husband and wife to be on the same page unless they're on the same page about something bad, right? So like if a husband and wife are on the same page about, laundering money for a Mexican drug cartel, right? that's not a good thing. I know Ozark is coming back here in a couple of weeks. I'm geared up for it. Anyway, so, right. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean, so one of the things we have to keep in mind when we're reading the Old Testament and interpreting it is that just because something is described in the Old Testament, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was good, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that God is sort of putting an imprimatur on it and saying it's good or okay, right? This is going to be really important later in Genesis with, polygamy, for example, right? There are going to be people who are going to come along and say, well, look, there's all this polygamy in Genesis and God doesn't explicitly say anything about it. So therefore polygamy was okay, right? Now, first of all, I disagree that God didn't say anything about it. There are a few places where he says things about it, but even so, that's still a very flawed argument, right? I mean, the New Testament tells us Judas went and hung himself. None of us would say, well, that means committing suicide is fine, right? We would obviously say, well, no, that was horrible. He should have repented the way St. Peter did, right? But a lot of this is so the appearance of the angel of the Lord to correct the situation is what tells us that what they did was wrong, right? Was sinful and needed to be corrected, right? Him entering, and that's the correction. And this is a constant theme throughout the scriptures, right? Is that over and over again, human beings have it in their minds to do evil, right? We are sinful, we conspire to do evil. And God nevertheless intervenes and brings good out of it. Right. So you see this with Joseph and his brothers, right? They try to murder him, they sell him into slavery, but God uses that to save the whole family from a famine, right? In Egypt, right? Over and over again. Of course, the ultimate example of this is when the people set out to murder Christ, right? But Christ himself brings our salvation out, right? So this is a pattern of how God works, right? So God allows human beings their free will, right? He doesn't stop Abram and Sarai from doing wrong, right? The angel of the Lord didn't show up as soon as they hatched this plan and say, whoa, no, time out, right? I'm going to give you and Sarai a son, right? Don't go ahead with this. Don't do it, right? God, makes the promises, and then it's up to Abram to trust. But then when Abram and Sarai do wrong and go ahead with this plan, right, then God intervenes to bring healing out of it, and ultimately he's going to bring, right, good out of it, right, despite their sort of ill intentions.
Father, it looks like there's a question in the chat, and I'll read it out loud. I would like to know why the descendants of Hagar were not God's chosen people also.
Yeah, so we have to get into what it means, the chosen people, right? That's part of it. So there are a ton. We talked about Abram has whole nations descended from him. So it's not just the Ishmaelites, right? It's going to be Isaac is going to have two sons, Jacob and Esau. From Esau, you're going to have the Edomites, right? And the Midianites are going to come from both those groups, right? And so there's lots of other children, and then you've got the Moabites and the Ammonites who are descended from Lot, who's Abram's nephew. They're part of the Abrahamite family, right? And part of this is we haven't been taught to read the Torah well in detail, frankly, because I don't want to get this taken off YouTube, but frankly, because a lot of modern Christians have adopted rabbinic Jewish readings of it, right? But if you read, for example, Deuteronomy chapter 2 and Deuteronomy chapter 4 carefully, yes, God says, I'm bringing Israel to the land of Canaan to give it to them. But what he says is, I'm doing that in the same way that I brought the Edomites to this land and gave it to them. And I brought the Moabites to this land and gave it to them. And I brought the Ammonites to this land, and I brought the Midianites to this land, right? So Israel is not different in that regard, right? He has this huge tract of land that he laid out at the end of chapter 15 that he's giving to Abraham's descendants. And each of those groups descended from Abraham gets part of it, right? They all share in that inheritance, right? But within this, and this is what St. Paul is talking about in Romans 9 through 11. I don't have time to go through all that here with our heart out, obviously. but even then it would take me a lot of time. What St. Paul talks about, though, is that we talked about how Abram has, there's seed plural, and then there's a seed singular that's pointing to Christ, right? And so St. Paul is going to point out that there is this one line that has, in the Old Testament, they talk about that line having the firstborn status, right? But there's this one line, and that line is the line that Christ is going to be born out of, right? So Christ is descended from Isaac rather than Ishmael, and he's descended from Jacob rather than Esau, and he's descended from Judah rather than Judah's 11 brothers, right? There's because obviously ancestry, right? You're going to go down one, right? And so Israel remember, Israel is Jacob's name. Israel was the chosen people in the sense that, and Judah was the chosen tribe. Remember, most of Israel gets wiped out in the Old Testament in 722 BC. The Jews, Jew is short for Judahite or Judean. That's just that one tribe, right? So when Christ says in the New Testament, for example, salvation is from the Jews, right? He's talking about himself. Christ was from the tribe of Judah. So Israel was chosen in that sense, that it was the branch of Abraham's family tree from which the Messiah, from which Jesus Christ was going to be born. But that is the way in which it was unique, right? Not in the sense of God loving them, blessing them, giving them land, right? Salvation, all of that stuff applied to everybody equally, right? Ruth, for example, later in the Old Testament, is a Moabite, not an Israelite. And she ends up being David's grandmother or great-grandmother, right? King David's great-grandmother was a Moabite, right? Who are descended from Abraham, but are not Israelites, right? So all of those things are general. That chosen is really focused, according to St. Paul, on that line from which the Messiah comes, right? And so for him, at the end of Romans 11, any person who is in communion with, who's in covenant with, who's in fellowship with Jesus Christ is an Israelite, regardless of their DNA, right? Regardless of their ancestry, right? And anyone who is not faithful to Jesus Christ is not part of Israel, regardless of their ancestry. We see this over and over again in the New Testament where people say, well, we're children of Abraham, right? And they're sort of told, at one point, God could make children of Abraham from these stones, right? Or Christ telling the Jewish leaders who hated him and wanted to kill him, no, you're not. You're children of your father, the devil. You're not the children of Abraham, right? Because you're nothing like Abraham. You're more like the devil. So that is the key thing. It's not about an ethnicity that's been chosen for salvation or one people group that's been chosen for salvation. It's about, there's this one people group that's going to produce the Messiah, and everyone who is faithful to the Messiah is an heir and an inheritor of the promises that were made to Abraham. So that wasn't a short answer particularly, but hopefully I covered what you wanted, Charlene.
Appreciate it, Father. We're actually a couple of minutes here to our hard stop. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to call it and say that we'll need to bring this to a close for today. But as always, I want to thank you, Father, for your time and for this wonderfully edifying and educational Bible study. This video will go up, God willing, this coming Saturday for anyone who wasn't able to attend it live. And I've made it a minor tradition to try to confirm what the next date will be in this Bible study. And it looks like February the 17th is the third Thursday in February. So that'll be our next one, which is the week before our rescheduled winter retreat, which is at the end of February. And hopefully anyone listening to this video who's in our diocese is making plans to attend that. It'll be in Atlanta, Georgia. The clergy retreat is on February 21st 3rd and 4th, and then the all DOMSE winter retreat for everybody in the diocese is on February 25th and 26th. God willing, it will still happen. We had to reschedule because of the Omicron variant and the rise in cases, but we're hoping that it drastically decreases in the next few weeks. And something very similar happened with the fall retreat. And so we're hoping the same thing happens here for the winter retreat. But thank you again, Father Stephen DeYoung, and thank you for those who attended with us live. I just want to say thanks and have a great rest of the evening, everybody.